Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Only Podcast. My name is Chris Vanini. I'm your host as usual, joined by theonlycolors.com managing editor, Joe Toohey. Joe, how you doing right now?
I'm doing well. I got a battery in my smoke alarm and just won a game of kickball, so we're doing
There you
well.
go. Well, that smoke alarm fix is I think will be appreciated by the listeners here. So, uh,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Also, I'm
So,
not dead, which is helpful.
oh, that's true. I guess I should retract that report then.
Yeah, I mean, not many media outlets are retracting statements anymore, but my death was premature.
There we go. So since we last talked last week, not a ton has happened. The Big Ten Media Days went through, depth chart came out, and Mark Dantonio was on ESPN on Wednesday. Before we do that, make sure you're following The Only Colors on Twitter at The Only Colors. As we get into camp and get into the football season here, there's going to be a ton of great stuff on the site. Got a lot more contributors working. So make sure you're always checking that out. Got some position previews going on. Joe wrote a good piece on the narrative of 2015.
Thanks, Chris.
In some news, MSU guard Eron Harris saw his OWI charge drop down to a reckless driving after pleading guilty, which is almost the exact same thing Corey Lucius got way back when, so not unprecedented there or anything. So that's about it with the basketball team. Not much going on, but football's where it's at. And also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or in the RSS feed if you want to get automatic downloads. It's the easiest way to listen to it. I listen to podcasts on my phone all the time, and if you like listening to this thing, I recommend you doing that. It's a lot easier probably than listening to it on your computer or going to the site or whatnot. But yeah, we're talking about football now. And before we get into the depth chart in the team, we're going to talk about Dantonio's appearances on ESPN Wednesday, which were only notable. They weren't notable for anything Dantonio said or did. What was notable was everything ESPN did during this trip. Now, several conferences had their coaches go to ESPN and go through what's considered the car wash, which means you're on Sports Center, radio shows, College Football Live, kind of go through a bunch of different events. The Big Ten was not doing that this year, but MSU, Penn State, and Northwestern had each reached out to ESPN to have their head coaches go on. Dantonio went on Wednesday, and the biggest reason you do something like this is not for any news or whatnot. It's to a little more exposure for your program and to kind of help in recruiting. And Dantonio very clearly made that a point because he made sure to say shout out to the recruits when he was on SportsCenter, and MSU tweeted a photo of Dantonio FaceTiming a recruit while he was at ESPN. So that's kind of what this trip was about. It's about to get publicity for your program. But the issue is the publicity coming out after this thing is not anything Dantonio did. It's what ESPN did, in that every single stop he was on, he was asked about Jim Harbaugh, which he's been asked about ever since Harbaugh was hired in, what was it, December, January. So the question's kind of old by now. It was fine to ask him about it when it happened, but at this point the season's about to start. There are more important things. And Kerry Champion asked Dantonio if there was any fear in the program after Harbaugh was hired, which is kind of a ridiculous question for any coach. And Dantonio simply said he's a proven coach, but players make plays, players win the game. So he was not happy about that question. He was not happy about it anytime he was asked it. And then I didn't catch this first time around, actually, but I'm going to block tweet a photo, a screen grab of a graphic of Dantonio on SportsCenter today. It's got a photo of Jim Harbaugh shirtless doing his thing with recruits. You've got the name label below that says Mike D'Antoni, as in the former NBA basketball coach, and then Dantonio in a small box with just like a scowl on his face. And that just perfectly summed up the entire trip there, because he because that's kind of the story coming out of this, is that MSU's got once again has to deal with a ton of questions about Michigan. Word got back to Connor Cook, who tweeted something like, Mike Dantonio, and people always want to know why the chip. So, Joe, you obviously you say you didn't quite catch it, but when you kind of see the situation, what happens? What's kind of just your takeaway from it?
Yeah, I mean, it's simultaneously entertaining and infuriating in some ways, right? And in a lot of ways, there's no good way to react, right? Like you see that tweet from MGO Blog, and my initial reaction was I wanted to respond with the photos of Brady Hoke getting interviewed by Harbaugh, or was it the reverse? It was Brady Hoke. No, it was
both. Yeah.
Hoke getting interviewed by Rich Rod,
right. Hoke getting interviewed by Rich Rod, and then Harbaugh getting interviewed by Hoke.
Right, which is what I wanted to reply, but really it doesn't mean anything anyways. The thing to take away really is that there hasn't been any reasons to talk trash from a blogger's perspective or from a fan base perspective because of play on the field since 2012. And even then, I mean, 12-10 game was not exactly anything to write home about. So it's one of those things where there's really the only decent reaction is no reaction. Same thing with Greg Henson on Twitter. I don't know if you
why do you follow him on Twitter?
Well, no, I got the Only Colors Twitter account blocked by Greg Henson.
You get angry on that thing sometimes.
Well, it's just so I'm getting to learn. But yeah, like it is what it is. And so yeah, the best thing you can do in these situations is just not react at all. And it sounds like that's exactly what Dantonio did while he was in the car wash or whatever it's called, right? I mean, he had no idea that his name was getting misspelled at the bottom of the screen, but
why can nobody get this right? This has been a thing for like years. Like I made it like a game on Twitter. Every once in a while, I would just search I would search Dantonio Lakers on Twitter, and you'd have a ton of people mixing up the names of Mike D'Antoni when he was a Lakers coach and Mark Dantonio. I don't understand how people still get this wrong, especially when you're ESPN. You've got like copy editors and fact checkers and stuff. How the hell does that get across? Like it wasn't even like an extra apostrophe in the name or something. It was the wrong first name. It was the wrong last name. Like I don't even know how that happens.
I'm glad that we've got another. This one was a little bit shorter segment, but of you ranting on the podcast. I think that it needs to be a recurring thing.
I mean, just from a journalistic perspective, that was quite embarrassing. I mean, you've got people who check that stuff. That's not a good look.
I'm with you. Yeah, so it is what it is. What's going to be entertaining is when the season actually starts, because there's a pretty decent shot that Michigan loses to Utah at Utah in that first week.
No, that's going to be an interesting one. I don't really know what to expect from either team there, because Utah had a number of changes. But home game, the thing with Michigan, and we have no clue about Michigan. They have not much proven talent at all, and part of that is because, I mean, not part of it because, but Harbaugh has barely said anything about personnel. Like everybody, a lot of national media love him, think he's interesting and quirky, which he is. But when it gets down to the nuts and bolts, he doesn't say anything. He doesn't talk at all about the personnel. He doesn't reveal anything, who's looking good. He'll just give generic answers or non-answers. And you get a situation like the Colin Cowherd interview where Colin wanted to get some just kind of talk football a little bit, talk him a little bit, and it just kind of went off the rails. So we don't know anything about the team. We don't know if Jake Rudock has looked great since transferring over. We don't know how Jabril Peppers looks, other than what players kind of said at Big Ten Media Day, because the coach doesn't say much of anything. So I don't know what to expect from Michigan this year. Everyone's kind of pinning him in the 6-6, 7-5 range, because you just think that's an average season. They could be better, they could be worse. I don't really know what to expect. I think in the long run they'll be good with Harbaugh, but for this first year, I have no clue what to expect from them.
I feel like it would be pretty hard for them to be much worse than last year. I mean, they ranked, I think, 85th in offensive FEI, and I think that they were 40-something in 41st, I think, in defensive FEI. And so my guess here is that they'll improve offensively. If for no other reason, then there's no way that they could be worse.
Yeah.
I mean, they were one of the worst Power 5 offenses last year.
Yet out of that, you're losing. I think they lost their quarterback in Gardner, their best receiver in Funchess, and you lose. I think they lost a running back. I think Justice Hayes is gone. They lost some running back, so it's in the offensive line was better, but it still wasn't good. So I don't know. I don't really know what to think.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I just really don't think it could get worse for them. And they do return a lot of starters. I mean, I think they return the most starters of any Big Ten team, although that's sort of, to me, a little bit of a misnomer in terms of actually determining how much experience a team brings back. I think it's one element of how much a team brings back because, percentage of letter winners returning is another metric, or, trying to estimate in every different position group, what percentage of production is returning, although it's harder for things like offensive linemen. Basically, all you can do for offensive linemen is track starts. So I actually put up a chart, an updated chart with, on one axis is F+ rating from last year. On the other axis is Phil Steele has an experience rating where he combines a bunch of different things all into one experience points system. That's a little better, I think, than just looking at returning starters or percentage of letter winners or any individual category. So that's pretty nice. And then the size of the bubble on the chart is the recruiting ranking for that team. So if you want to take a look at that, check out theonlycolors.com.
Do that. Good stuff.
Yeah, but it's always, yes, as a scatter plot. So, yeah, I mean, Michigan will be better next year, I think, is what it all boils down to.
You know what we're doing right here? We're getting off track, and we're doing exactly what ESPN did with Dantonio, and that's Michigan too much, aren't we? That's what we're doing. But see, I'll say this though,
self-defeating, man.
I think in the end, it not that it was going to be a bad thing, but I think this ends up coming across as a good thing for the program in ways that they wouldn't have expected. It's very clear that MSU is upset about this. Of all the bulletin board material stuff that MSU has gotten or used ever since the little brother comment in 2007, I honestly think this might be number 2 behind that. I mean, I know Fitz Toussaint kind of talked down to MSU in 2013, I think, but I think, and this isn't anything Michigan did, obviously, but I think when you've got MSU coming off a Cotton Bowl win, preseason ranked number 6, Dantonio's got ESPN to himself, and the story coming out of it is about Jim Harbaugh, not Harbaugh's fault or anything, but I think Dantonio goes back to East Lansing. I think players, when they get to camp, you maybe get a little bit more, little extra motivation. I don't think it's going to be a driving force like maybe the little brother comment was, but yeah, I got in a Twitter debate of this with Mike Wilson and Alex Cook from MGO Blog and someone else about that idea of where motivation kind of plays in. When you look at this, Joe, maybe it's different for you, but when you look at it, how do you compare it to maybe the other, since MSU always talks about the chip on the shoulder and everything, where do you think this instance kind of ranks with maybe the other stuff?
So one thing I think you left out of that whole conversation was the 2008 guarantee by Brandon Graham that
I forgot about that.
That was a pretty good one. Actually, it was funny.
I guess I forgot because I didn't take it seriously because they were what, like 5-5 at the time or something, or 5-6.
Not even. They were 3 and I think they were 3 and
Or,
5.
right. 3-5 or something. So I guess I didn't really. Maybe I just didn't take that seriously.
It was funny though.
I forgot about it.
In the last place I lived in Ann Arbor was a house that Brandon Graham actually used to live in. So we actually still got mail for Brandon Graham at the house, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I mean, I mean, and the other thing you didn't mention was the stake planting in Spartan Stadium last year. Yeah. Although that was kind of, even as it happened, just goofy. I don't think any MSU players took that particularly seriously.
I think they did. I think they did take that one seriously. That's a good one that I also had forgotten. Maybe I think MSU was going to win that game no matter what happened. But I mean that was why they went for that final score at the end. And no, I absolutely think it motivated them. Right? I mean, right before kickoff, just gives a little bit more fire.
Right? Yeah, maybe. I could see that. But I think to me the Brandon Graham stuff, I don't know, will just stick with me a little bit more probably because MSU hadn't won a game since 2001 in the series. I mean, once you hit 2014 and you've won, 6 of the last 7, 5 of the last 6, it's a little less interesting. But yeah, I mean, as far as that goes, I don't know. I don't think that maybe it's a difference in degree, but not a difference in kind versus when Rich Rod was hired and when Brady Hoke was hired. I mean, MSU as a program is at a different level than it was when Hoke or Rich Rod was hired. But I don't know. It's just the same kind of deal where you get a bump in interest because you got a new coach. So the interesting thing is that there's a lot of questions I would have liked to hear Dantonio answer, like how are you going to deal with not only Narduzzi leaving, but how you're going to who you're going to play at corner.
I mean,
there are a lot of questions there to be.
Yeah, that's the difference when you get to TV interviews as opposed to even a radio interview is a little different, or if it's a one-on-one with a writer. With a writer, you'll get specifics because you're not up against the time. You don't have to get everything in say 3 minutes. So when you get on the TV interviews, you kind of just get I think we talked about this last week actually. You just kind of get the generic answers because they're basically just there to be a soundbite. It's not really anything Dantonio is going to say on the show that they just know. It's more just, hey, we have this coach on the show, watch it, and it's the image more than the content. And I think that's kind of what it was here.
But that's why it's so frustrating, right? Because if it's just the image and you don't get the name right. Then...
Right. I mean, I just think, if you're a Texas fan watching college football live, you don't really care about MSU's cornerback battle. So I can understand why they kind of go for the generic questions because there's not really anything going to get there. When you got a radio interview and you got 10 to 15 minutes, you can kind of get into some more specifics and tie in some stories and whatnot. They're just different interviews. If it's a print interview, then you can get real specific with things because, it's just a different medium. So I can understand why that happens, but yeah, I mean, I didn't expect anything to be said. The whole point of this trip was basically to just show recruits that Dantonio's at ESPN on his own, make them look like a big deal. And it did in that sense, and it also added the chip on the shoulder. And I think this is also different from maybe all that other bulletin board material because this isn't MSU sucks where Michigan were great. This was a statement about the program and that it clearly was not respected or well known enough to get the coach's name right on the graphic and to open up your conversation talking about another team. Nick Saban left MSU in part because Michigan went to the Orange Bowl while MSU got sent to the Capital One Bowl despite having the same record and despite MSU beating Michigan. He knew that MSU was always going to be second fiddle to Michigan. There were a lot of factors on why he left, obviously, but that was one of them. And that's why Dantonio was the perfect hire, the perfect time for MSU, because he's a guy who's going to get if he reaches that top success, he's going to get interest from a school like Texas, which he did. And he's staying where he's at, and he's continuing to build. And that's why he was the perfect hire at the time. That's what Saban wasn't interested in doing and hasn't been interested in doing because he's moved around so much. So I think that's it illustrates the two differences in the coaches, and this incident illustrates why Saban left and why Dantonio stays where he is, and why the program continues to have something to fight for.
Yeah, and like I wrote in sort of I don't even know what you call it, a column or something in my blog post that went up yesterday. College football is a game of longevity, right? I mean, you forget that there's been 118 years of Michigan State football. Mark Dantonio has 8 of those 118 years, so it's still a blip in the overall history of not only the program but in the rivalry as well. So that's one of the things where, if sort of deserved, right? You should have a chip on your shoulder. You should still, if you're MSU, you should be trying to prove that the program is at the same level year in, year out, because the way that you do that is by being the superior team over a long period of time and solidifying gains, right? I mean, this team doesn't need to win a national championship or even win a Big Ten title for it to sort of continue to cement the legacy of Dantonio's renaissance in the program, right? If MSU wins 11 games, goes 11-1, loses to Ohio State, and doesn't make the Big Ten championship game, that's still a very successful season.
But let me ask you this: if MSU wins the national championship this year, is his name going to be consistently spelled wrong all over the place, or do you think it still will?
I think they get it right after a national title, because there'd just be so much coverage of something like that, right?
Right.
But the other thing would be, another thing that could really help this program is a Heisman. It's there are only, I think, 36 programs that have a Heisman winner. MSU is not one of them, and even if MSU wasn't to win the national title, if Connor Cook was to have an incredible year and win the Heisman, that in and of itself would be a good enough accomplishment to really help the program in some sense as well. So it's going to take time, and if that means having to beat Michigan 5 of 6 years in a row again for some period of time, or 6 of 7 for some period of time, I'd be pretty happy with that. But they got to continue to prove it, which is frustrating, but it requires some patience, I guess.
I mean, MSU I don't think is ever going to reach the stage of a program like a Michigan or an Ohio State, where just because you're who you are, you're news. I think MSU is always going to kind of be in that Wisconsin level where you'll get the attention when you're good, but if not, you won't. And it's kind of because it's kind of at the same time, a boring program. There's no real news for how many straight off seasons now, other than a couple minor incidents here and there. I mean, the most notable offseason news for Dantonio in the past few years has been Dat Bull recruiting guy going and doing rap, and then maybe the Gavin Cup situation, which, by the way, ESPN asked him about that twice on 2 different segments. They specifically asked about Gavin Cup, which I don't know. Again, how that's an NCAA violation to speak on specific recruits, and I don't think they did it on purpose, but I just want to know how you don't know that, especially on College Football Live, to know that the head coach cannot speak on recruits. That's an NCAA violation. I was also surprised that Dantonio answered the question. He didn't say Gavin Cup. He spoke in generalities about communication, but he could have just said, I think the old Dantonio would have just said, we're not allowed to talk about recruits. I'll just leave it at that. But he made a point to talk about and emphasize how much communication matters because of the whole Gavin Cup apparently didn't tell MSU he was going to the Ohio State camp. So that's where this trip again came. The purpose of the trip was recruiting. He could have just said no, but he took that opportunity to send a message to the recruits at the same time, not a shout out to the recruits, a serious message to the recruits too. So that was another strange situation with that. But yeah, Dantonio's kind of boring. He doesn't give great answers. Harbaugh, for one, more people are interested in Michigan because it's Michigan. It's just, the TV ratings and everything prove that. And also, Harbaugh, every once in a while, might give you a quirky answer. You're not really going to get that with Dantonio. So it's kind of just boring. I think I don't think MSU's not going to be Baylor, where Art Briles is out. Another guy who's open and quirky and has good quotes and stuff like that. So that's a program that becomes a cool program. Michigan State they've become a respected program. I don't think they've become necessarily the cool program offensively. Defensively, they like it. People who hardcore football fans like this program, but if you're the casual Twitter fan, I don't think Michigan State excites you as much. So I think that's part of just a lot of the thing as to why MSU doesn't get the respect. Not the respect, but the recognition that maybe a team in its position and a team that has accomplished what it has would. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be that sort of second tier of programs that aren't the blue bloods, and MSU is part of that, alongside a Baylor or a TCU. Programs that maybe and MSU actually has more history than those programs specifically, but so the question I would pose to you is, do you think Oregon is a blue blood at this point, or do you think that they're still sort of on the cusp? Because I feel like they're almost the perfect example. They, even historically, were not a very strong program. And, over the last 15 or so years has really come around and become a perennial contender. So to me, it's almost like an Oregon model, right? I mean, not the uniforms, but something along those lines where by being a contender every year for a long period of time, they've become nationally known.
I don't think so, but I think part of that is because they haven't won the national championship yet.
Right.
I think that's one of those kind of benchmarks you got to hit. They've been there twice, and their offense is they're known for their offense, and their offense has struggled in 2 national championship games, including one against an Auburn defense that was really not that good. So I guess we're kind of getting into labels and whatnot. A blue blood. They're an exciting program, but they also don't recruit maybe as well as people would think. They're not bringing in top 10 classes every year. They're usually in the 20s or teens or something like that. So that's another thing. You don't see them at the top on signing days, but they score the points. They've not as much as Mark Helfrich, but with Chip Kelly, you had the coach who was quirky and had some interesting quotes and stuff like that. So you got some stuff that way. So,
and you always know that it's Oregon because of the uniforms too, which help a lot.
Yeah, I'll say this: everybody's not you, but everybody thinks Oregon got new uniforms and then they got good and people liked them. That's not what it is. First of all, they had Mike Bellotti where they had a string of good success. Second of all, their facilities are amazing, and they have been ever since probably the 90s. I think is when they started to build these new facilities, and then you bring in a guy like Chip Kelly who runs a high energy offensive system, and you get players that want to play like that. That's what draws people to Oregon. The jerseys are just the cherry on the top. But what made Oregon what it is was the incredible investment from Phil Knight and Nike in producing what you need to have a foundation to build a program, and then having a string of success going from Bellotti to Kelly to Helfrich, where you kind of stay in that same mold. They've got assistant coaches there who have been there since the 80s, the 90s. They've had amazing continuity in some spots. So I think there's a lot of things that go into that make Oregon what it was more than jerseys. Not that you're saying that, but just something I see a lot. And a lot of times when a team reveals new jerseys, they go, "Oh, Oregon got new jerseys," and look at that. But that's not why Oregon's good. That's just a little sprinkle on the top. So anything else you wanted to touch on this? I think overall MSU Dantonio going on the car wash. I think MSU wins in 2 ways. I think 1, it was good for recruiting. And 2, he comes home with a little bit more motivation as camp opens this week.
Yeah, and it gave us something to talk about on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Otherwise we were just going to talk about talk about depth chart. The other thing, depth chart was the only thing we were going to talk about. Came out Big Ten Media Days last week. Not really many surprises. No Delton Williams. He's not going to be in camp till like a week or two into things. So it's Gerald Holmes or Madre London. That's a true sophomore, a sophomore and a redshirt freshman for the tailback spot. That's one thing to watch. It's kind of a battle. Interestingly, D'Anthony Arnett was an or starter at the Z position, at the Z wide receiver position. He's been a topic of discussion for a long, long time. We haven't seen, how these guys are going to look. So, but and then at cornerback, Demetrius Cox at the boundary, lone starter, and then at the field, Darian Hicks or Arjun Colhoun. I never know how to say that. I didn't realize Colhoun was a fifth-year senior now. I feel like he's been a guy who's just kind of been waiting in the wings for a long time now. But that's the other spot that's a real big question mark. Darian Hicks started all year and doesn't have a job locked down, which I think says something about the state of the defensive backfield and what they're looking for. Joe, when you look at the depth chart, anything jump out to you, anything you're going to watch for as maybe by the time the week 1 depth chart comes out?
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting that at the running back position that Gerald Owens is now a full-time defensive tackle. He's not even listed as a tailback. And I think it's also interesting that TJ Harrell is back at star only. So I think those things are going to be pretty interesting. They must be pretty happy with the combination of Holmes, London, and Tompkins at running back, as well as Delton Williams once he returns. So that's pretty interesting. Nick Tompkins is now full-time at tailback as well. He wasn't listed at corner at either side boundary or field. It's not super surprising to me that Arnett is an or with Kings just because Kings did miss some time.
That's true too.
So it's not super surprising. In general, the lack of ors is interesting. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing.
You normally see a lot of that on the early Dantonio depth charts.
Right. So I don't know if that's positive or negative, really.
You look at some of the spots. I think you've got a team here where a lot of the starters were already pretty set. The offensive line, you already knew who the 5 were going to be. It's very clear those 5 are ahead of everybody else. There wasn't really any of the backups you expected to start this year. Wide receiver-wise, Burbridge is a fifth-year senior. Kings is a senior. Shelton has been starting and is a junior. So you kind of figured those were the next guys up. Quarterback's what it is. The defensive line, it's the 4 guys we kind of knew were going to start. There were some good backups, but no one we thought was going to take over the top 4. And then linebacker, similarly, basically the only guys with real playing experience are the starters. So I think there seems to be quite the drop-off between starters and backups in terms of experience on this team. So there might be a talent depth, but I don't think there's an experience depth other than the defensive line. But other than that, there's not experience depth, as I guess is how I would look at that in terms of not having or starters.
Yeah, so I've got a question for you. Do you think that the biggest question mark on the team is at running back or at corner?
I think it's at corner because I think Delton Williams, when all is said and done, is going to establish himself as far and away the top running back on the team.
So I agree with you completely, but and for a lot of reasons. But I was getting into it on Twitter with some people, and I think I jumped in on that. Yeah. So the interesting thing to me is that there's several things. One is I think running back is a significantly easier position to pick up as a true freshman. So I think between Holmes, London, Williams, and LJ Scott, who's the highly touted freshman coming in, I think between the 4 of them, 1 guy or 2 guys will emerge and be pretty good players, pretty productive players. And at corner, I think there were just nobody who made themselves gave themselves playing time because they had to get on the field, right? They had to flip it around when Darian Hicks proved that he wasn't going to be able to hold down that spot in a satisfactory manner against major competition. So I think The good news at corner is that I think they'll play more guys than they used to. Typically, they'd only play 2 or 3 corners in a given game. And against Baylor, they started to rotate those guys through. You saw Colquhoun and Edmondson and Hicks and
And you
Lippett
also
and
threw
Waynes.
Tony Lippett back there.
Right. So I think that's a good sign. If they start to rotate guys through a little bit more, that might be helpful in terms of keeping those guys fresh throughout a game. I'm not sure.
I think it's good if they have the physical, if they have the ability. If you're rotating guys because the one guy's not good enough, it's a different story.
Right, and I think that corner is an especially difficult position in this defense, just scheme-wise in general, right? I mean, you have to have the physical ability to jam guys and then the speed to make up distance if necessary, and also just the technical ability to do all of those things. Now, there are guys who have been in this program for some time, right? I mean, as you mentioned, Colquhoun is a guy who's been in the program for a long time. Demetrius Cox is already a junior, which is crazy. Darian Hicks is a junior and played significant time last year. So, it's very possible that those guys will come around, but it's not going to be a defensive backfield with Trey Waynes and Darqueze Dennard, that's for sure. So.
No, and when no matter if Narduzzi came back or not, they were going to have to make some tweaks because it got clear that once Dennard was out and once they realized Darian Hicks wasn't up to snuff compared to the previous guys who were first-round picks, you couldn't leave him on an island anymore. You couldn't. I mean, Waynes could do Waynes could do it, but you couldn't leave Darian Hicks on an island anymore. And now Wayne's gone. You can't. I don't think you can leave any of these guys on an island. So you're going to have to tweak that scheme. You're not going to be able to just play your straight regular quarters coverage all the time like they used to. So I'm curious how, especially since Harlan Barnett is going to be calling the plays. He was the defensive backs coach. I'm curious how this scheme is going to adjust a little bit. It'll be mostly similar. I mean, the continuity and the scheme of the coaches is a huge part of this program's success, but I think they do have to adjust and account for the talent drop off in the defensive backfield, because when you look at the defensive depth chart, I think that defensive line is going to be really, really good. I think the linebackers are going to be pretty solid. I have a lot of question marks about the defensive backfield. You've got, for one, R.J. Williamson, who got benched a couple times last year because he struggled at strong safety. And at free safety, you've got Monte Nicholson, who he was a freshman, admittedly, but he did get burned quite a few times, and him and Williamson were kind of going back and forth on starting. So now you've got two safeties there who had questions last year, and then you throw in Cox, who's a converted safety, who's a great athlete, but we don't know his corner skills being outside the program. And then you've got Hicks, who you know what he's got, or you know what he had last year, and what he had last year was okay, but it clearly hasn't been enough to even establish himself here. And he's the only guy of those cornerbacks who he's far and away has the most experience of those guys, and he is an or starter. So I think there's a lot of concerns there.
Right, and I would say one interesting thing, though, is I'm not concerned so much about teams that don't have elite quarterbacks. So against teams, your average Big Ten team, against Rutgers or against Purdue, for instance, I'm not too concerned about the defensive backfield, because I don't think the defensive backfield will matter quite as much as it does against teams that can, give their quarterbacks a pocket and allow their quarterbacks to, throw. So that's one major benefit of getting Oregon so early on the schedule, is that their quarterback situation is unsettled. Heck Dorland at the Cover 4 had a good article about the unsettled nature of Oregon's quarterback situation. Vernon Adams for them has not yet enrolled. He still has to finish up a math class at Eastern Washington, I believe he was at, before he can get on campus in Oregon. So
he's had the playbook, but he hasn't even worked out with his teammates yet.
Right.
So if you think a month from now he's going to be able to just come into East Lansing and start and do well, I think that's a tall task. So I mean, that game's looking a lot different than it did when he announced his transfer.
Right. So that is helpful, and that Ohio State game is going to be tough, even if two very good corners emerge from some sort of competition. So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things is the defense has gotten this program to a certain place, and then it seemed to have topped out a little bit. So the tweaks that happened there.
Offense carried that team. Offense carried that team last year. Nationally, people still look at it as a defense. That's another thing with maybe the respect deal. Nobody realized this team scored more than 40 points a game last year. Like, that's crazy. Like, they were up there with Oregon and Baylor and TCU and Ohio State as one of the best offenses in college football last year. But never really got that respect, I don't think, offensively. And I think this year, again, offense is going to have to carry the load, at least early on. And I think the running back position can be offset by Cook's running ability for one, but also his experience and the fact that despite losing Lippett and Mumphrey, you still got Shelton, Kings, and Burbridge, guys who are been in the program for 3, 4, 5 years. So I mean, offense is still going to carry this team because I think defense is going to have to work things out. But I will say having that defensive line will make it easier because it all starts up front. Obviously, if you can get pressure, and this defense is all about getting pressure.
Yeah, and one last interesting thing I thought was at Big Ten Media Days, Dantonio talked about staying the course with the defense. So I'm pretty sure there won't be any major changes. I think for the most part, it'll probably be changes to the I forget exactly what the name of the package was, but the passing downs package where they went to sort of a 3-3-5. With only 3 down linemen, there might be some changes in that package and maybe a little additional safety help or something like that in certain situations, or maybe running a little cover 3 or cover 1. So that'll be really interesting stuff once the season hits, and it's not something I think we'll see much against Western. So it's sort of that Oregon game is going to tell us a lot about the entire season, I think. Which is somewhat terrifying, but also exciting.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the rest of the Big Ten, Nebraska. I mean, they almost won in East Lansing last year. I guess they almost made that comeback, but you lose Abdullah. I'm still low on Tommy Armstrong. Indiana, if their quarterback stays healthy, they've at least got an offense. Michigan, I don't think is really going to challenge MSU. And then you've got Ohio State at the very end of the year. So, like you said, that Oregon game is pretty much going to be. I mean, they finished with Ohio State and Penn State, which are probably the two toughest conference games. So that Oregon game, you win that, you can really get on a roll. If you lose that, kind of in that position where you're on the outside looking in and just got to try to ride the wave and stay on and try to make a charge late like they did in 2013.
Yeah, I think another topic for a future podcast should be if MSU loses to Ohio State but wins out, what are the circumstances where MSU would end up making the playoff anyways?
I don't think – I think the fact that it's later in the year hurts them. Honestly,
yeah, that's true.
Because you've got the recency, is that the word? Recency bias.
Yeah, exactly.
Where the last thing people are going to remember is a loss. I don't think anyone's going to get into the playoff. Oh, I guess no, they have the Penn State game afterward, so that's not true. But I don't think losing at the very end there you're going to get in. This isn't like the BCS where yeah.
Right. I think the only way that it happens is if it's a close game against Ohio State, number one. Number two,
you're gonna need. I'm sorry, I don't know. Keep going.
No, that's no worries. First, it would have to be a close game against Ohio State. Second, Ohio State would have to be undefeated and appear to be a total powerhouse otherwise, right? Because then you could make an argument that the Big Ten is just really strong. The Big Ten East specifically is really strong or something like that. And you'd also have to have a scenario in which there are, of the other P5 conferences, there are conference champions that were relatively weak, division champions that end up winning their conference championship game or something like that, right? Because then those conference champions or teams that lost their conference championships wouldn't have arguments against MSU being in.
The only way I think
specific.
the only way I think MSU gets in is if it's a situation like 2007 where LSU lost its final regular season game, Ohio State lost to Illinois. And they somehow end up in the championship because Missouri loses to Oklahoma, and West Virginia inexplicably loses to Pitt. I mean, it would need to be crazy. I don't think that's going to happen. So
right. So then that's interesting. So then the reason I asked that question is, so if MSU loses to Oregon but beats Ohio State, ends up winning the Big Ten with one loss, they're in the playoff almost certainly, right?
It depends. It depends how Oregon is. I'm not gonna say they're in, because if you had accounted for what TCU and Baylor, if you kind of look at we thought Ohio State was dead after week 2. I mean, I know a lot of people thought it was dead, but you really kind of did. You didn't see things shaking out, and it's still controversial, the fact that Ohio State jumped TCU and Baylor. So it's hard to say because it's going to depend on a lot of other things. Honestly, I wouldn't want to say anything definitive. I think MSU's chances are more likely if they lose to Oregon. If you lose one game, I think their chances are a lot better losing to Oregon than losing to Ohio State, because you've got for one, you don't have the recency situation, and 2, you've got a conference championship game to play, which is another little notch to add.
Right, but to me in general, then the importance of the Oregon game is more about making the Ohio State game less important, right? So if you beat Oregon, there's some small chance that even if you lose to Ohio State, you could still make the national title game. Whereas,
but see, I don't think they would.
I think if you lose to Oregon and you lose to Ohio State, there's just no chance.
If they lose along the way before, we're assuming that they beat everybody in between, which is
right. Yeah.
But I don't think the Ohio State game, if MSU beats everybody else other than Oregon, the Ohio State game is either going to be super important, as in they had beaten Oregon and a potential playoff spot is on the line here, or it's going to be really important where a conference championship opportunity but not a national championship game is on the line. If they beat everybody, it's going to be a big game. I don't think it'll be – it's going to be an important game no matter what happens with Oregon. If they beat everybody else, I don't remember what I'm saying anymore. But no, I don't think it affects it. I don't think it really affects it. It either makes it really important or super important, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think there's any way MSU makes a playoff without winning its conference championship, which would presumably mean beating Ohio State.
Right, but so I guess my ultimate point there is just that it feels to me like that Oregon game is really significantly less important than the Ohio State game, because win right. The Oregon game and win the conference, and being undefeated in conference, and you're obviously in. Lose to Oregon, but still win the conference, and I think that there's a much better chance than beating Oregon and losing to Ohio State, right? So to me, the importance of the Oregon game is mostly that it preserves some small chance at still making the playoff and losing to Ohio State, right? It's a right. very small chance, but it's still there.
It's like what I used to say about the Notre Dame game, and that's that it didn't really matter. Back when MSU, 07, 08, 09, 06, 05, they weren't going to be making a BCS game. All that mattered was what they did in conference. So they could lose to Notre Dame early. If they beat Notre Dame, they got a little bit extra more hype. They lost to Notre Dame. Didn't really matter, because all that matters is their conference championship. 2013, we didn't expect them to go to the Rose Bowl. We didn't expect them to be in play there. When they lost to Notre Dame, it was just like, okay, the offense still sucks. It wasn't, this is going to hurt our chances for anything, because I don't think at the time, coming off 6-7, coming off 7-6. I don't think anybody expected an ECS or a division type game. They were just hoping for anything. So I don't think it matters for the playoff, but if you lose it, there's still plenty to play for, and that's why I like about college football in a sense. Actually, you can get these major matchups that mean enough, but maybe don't mean the end. It's not like when you get an early season, like I cannot get excited for NFL games until we get into the very final weeks or the playoffs, because it's just Patriots Broncos week 3. I don't care. It doesn't really matter. Both these teams are going to be good and make the playoffs. It's not like, I don't know, not really relevant to the conversation there, but just
I agree.
I like the idea of non-conference game. I love the idea of the conference championship in college football, making that important. And a little off tangent here, but if I was to do a playoff, I would do 8 teams, conference championships of the 5 Power 5 teams, champion of the group of 5, and 2 wild cards. Because that way, the conference championship is the most important thing. You can lose it. It encourages you to schedule big games for early on in case you need a wild card. But if you lose, you can still get into the playoff if you win a conference championship game. That makes every game important. And that's one of the things I love about college football.
But it almost feels like what you just described, and I'm playing devil's advocate here. I'm not sure exactly if what I'm about to say is something that I even agree with wholeheartedly. But if you're talking about 8 teams, right? So let's say that there were 8 teams for the playoff this coming year, right? To me, then that Oregon game, the importance of it is significantly less because,
right,
if you win or lose, you have to win your conference, or by winning your conference, you make the playoff. If you win it, and I mean, it might give you the opportunity to not win your conference, but still make the playoff. So it just makes the game, less important. To me, it seems like now
it makes it less important. It makes it less important, but it's still important.
Right. So it's interesting. It does. I'm not sure I necessarily feel this way, but it does seem like it could have the effect of diluting the regular season if the playoff got large enough, right?
If it got, I think 8 is the number with the formula I just said. And I hate that we're talking. Didn't I rant about this last week? I think I did. Talking about the playoff. So now we're kind of getting into it, but we're getting into it relative. We got into it relative to the MSU conversation, and we've been going for about an hour here, so we can probably wrap this up. But
yeah, I was wondering. We had
I wouldn't want to expand it for the sake of expanding it. Not to mention, 16 games is a hell of a lot of games for teams. You got to space those out better and let players get some rest. But I would do 8, but I would say a conference championship gets you in, because I think that's how you make the regular season still matter. If it's just picking 8 teams from a pool, then I think that makes it matter less. That's just how I feel about it. So, you got anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. I think we've tangented enough for this podcast, at least.
Yes. So go, people listening, you can go enjoy potato chips off your shoulders, because MSU is the underdog again at number 6 in the country. Somehow it happened, but it did. It's amazing. It always happens. So it should be interesting. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You can follow at The Only Carlos on Twitter. I'm at Chris Fanini. He's at Jobin2E. Make sure you check out the site. Got a lot of good stuff coming up, especially with the season starting. So for Joe, this is Chris, and thanks for listening, everybody. See you.
Thanks, guys.